The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not the usual clean freshwater scent that drifts across Carter Lake every morning, but something sharp and chemical that didn't belong anywhere near water that had been part of my family for 3 generations. I was standing on the old cedar dock my grandfather built in 1962, the same dock where he taught my dad to fish and where my dad taught me, and the quiet felt wrong. Too quiet. No ripples. No insects buzzing over the surface. Just a strange stillness hanging over the water like the lake itself was holding its breath. My name is Daniel Carter, and that lake in front of me, Carter Lake, sits on 47 acres of land my grandfather bought back when this part of Texas was nothing but ranch roads and barbed wire fences. Back then, he dug the basin with rented equipment and stubborn determination, turning a dry patch of land into a deep freshwater lake that became the heart of this property. Over the decades, it did more than hold water. It irrigated fields during drought years, gave neighbors a place to fish on summer weekends, and turned quiet farmland into one of the most beautiful pieces of land in the county. I grew up casting lines from that dock, watching bass break the surface at sunrise, learning patience the way only fishing can teach it. So when I saw the first pale shape floating near the reeds that morning, something inside my chest tightened before my brain even processed what my eyes were seeing. A fish drifted belly up near the shoreline, slowly rocking against the cattails. Then I noticed another, and another. A faint, oily shimmer spread across the surface in the early light, and that chemical smell burned the back of my throat as a breeze carried it across the dock. That's when I knew something was very wrong. I walked the shoreline for nearly 20 minutes, scanning the water, counting more fish than I wanted to see floating near the edges. Whoever did this hadn't just messed with my lake. They'd tried to ruin it. And I already had a pretty good idea who thought they had the right to do something like that. See, about half a mile downstream from here sits a brand new subdivision called Willow Ridge Estates. 200 identical beige houses, manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, and an HOA president who treats community rules like the 10 Commandments. Her name is Karen Whitmore, and in the 3 years since that development went up, she's made it her personal mission to remind me that my lake, my fishing boat, and my old wooden dock don't exactly match the premium lakeside aesthetic her neighborhood marketing brochures promised buyers. According to Karen, my fishing lines ruin the view. My truck parked by the dock lowers property values. And the occasional group of friends coming over to fish on a Saturday afternoon apparently threatens the entire social fabric of her perfect little neighborhood. She sent letters, filed complaints, called county offices more times than I can count. But standing there on that dock, staring out at water that now smelled like a chemistry lab accident, I realized something Karen Whitmore clearly didn't. The lake she was so desperate to control wasn't just a lake. And the people living in those beautiful houses downstream had no idea that the water running through their entire neighborhood depended on the same lake someone had just tried to poison. I grew up believing that water tells the truth if you pay attention long enough. My grandfather used to say that every lake has a memory, and Carter Lake had been remembering our family since 1958. He bought this land when it was nothing but dry pasture and stubborn clay soil that cracked open every summer under the Texas sun. Back then there were no subdivisions, no homeowners associations, no neat rows of identical houses pretending to be nature. Just wind, cattle fences, and a man with a vision that most people thought was crazy. My grandfather rented a small bulldozer and spent months carving a basin into the earth, shaping the land until rainwater and runoff from the surrounding hills could gather into something permanent. He lined the banks with native grass to stop erosion, planted willow trees along the southern edge, and built a simple overflow channel so the water would stay clean and balanced through every season. What started as a muddy pond slowly turned into a deep freshwater lake that stretched nearly 12 acres across at full capacity. By the time my father was a teenager, the place had become a small paradise. Bluegill and largemouth bass thrived in the clear water. Turtles basked on the fallen logs near the eastern bank. During long summer evenings, the surface shimmered with the quiet rhythm of insects and rising fish. My father grew up fishing those waters before school, and when I was a kid, he carried on the same tradition. Saturday mornings meant waking up before sunrise, grabbing a tackle box that smelled like metal hooks and old plastic worms, and walking down to that cedar dock while the mist still hovered over the water. I learned patience there. I learned how quiet a place can feel when the world wakes up slowly around you. I also learned something else that my grandfather took very seriously. This lake was never just decoration. It was working land. The water fed irrigation lines that kept pastures alive during dry seasons, and decades ago the county approved a controlled outlet that allowed excess water to flow toward the lower valley during heavy rain. My grandfather kept every permit, every survey map, every property record filed neatly in a metal cabinet inside the old barn. He believed landowners should understand their rights better than anyone trying to challenge them. For most of my life, nobody ever did challenge them. The surrounding land stayed quiet ranch country until about 4 years ago when construction crews arrived half a mile downstream and started clearing trees to build Willow Ridge estates. At first I thought it would not matter. People move out to the country for peace, and I figured new neighbors might even enjoy seeing a real lake instead of a decorative fountain in the middle of a concrete circle. What I did not expect was how quickly one person could turn a peaceful neighborhood into a running argument about control, appearance, and property values. The day Karen Whitmore introduced herself, she stood on the far side of the fence line wearing sunglasses and holding a clipboard like she was conducting an inspection. She smiled politely while explaining that she was the president of the Homeowners Association for Willow Ridge Estates, and that many of the residents had paid a premium for homes advertised with beautiful natural lake views. I remember the way the wind carried the smell of freshly cut grass from the subdivision behind her as she spoke in that calm, confident tone people use when they believe they already run the conversation. According to Karen, the residents loved the lake scenery. They just did not love the fishing boats, the occasional pickup truck near the dock, or the fact that my friends sometimes spent Saturday afternoons casting lines from the shoreline. She said it disrupted the peaceful aesthetic the neighborhood promised homeowners. I remember looking past her toward the neat rows of rooftops and thinking how strange it was that a lake older than their entire neighborhood suddenly needed permission to exist the way it always had. I should have realized that conversation was only the beginning. Karen Whitmore did not yell or threaten the way some people do when they want control. She was much more polished than that. She smiled, thanked me for my time, and drove away in a white Lexus that looked like it had never touched a gravel road. But over the next few weeks the pattern started to reveal itself, the way small cracks appear in a windshield before you understand how deep they run. The first letter arrived in my mailbox 2 weeks later, printed on thick paper with the Willow Ridge Estates logo across the top. It politely informed me that several residents had expressed concern about unauthorized recreational activity visible from the lakeside properties. Apparently, a group of my friends fishing from the dock one Saturday afternoon had disrupted the peaceful viewing environment advertised to homeowners. I remember standing in the kitchen reading that letter while the coffee maker hissed behind me, trying to understand how a lake that had existed for more than 60 years suddenly needed approval from people who had been there for 6 months. I ignored the letter. The lake was on my land. The dock was on my land. And fishing in my own water did not require permission from a homeowners association that had no jurisdiction beyond their fence line. But Karen did not ignore things. She escalated them. The second notice arrived through certified mail. This one mentioned concerns about motorized watercraft disturbing the natural viewscape. The boat in question was my grandfather's old 12-foot aluminum fishing boat with a quiet electric trolling motor that barely made more noise than the wind across the reeds. A week later, the county zoning office called to say someone had filed a complaint claiming my dock was built without proper permits. That investigation lasted about 10 minutes once the inspector saw the original paperwork dated 1962 still preserved in a protective sleeve in the barn. The man actually chuckled while handing the documents back to me and said he wished more people kept records that well. But the complaints kept coming. One about parking near the shoreline. One about guests visiting too frequently. One about possible environmental concerns related to fishing activity. It was like watching someone throw handfuls of paper darts hoping one might accidentally hit a target. Meanwhile, Karen started appearing along the fence line more often, walking with 2 or 3 residents while pointing toward the lake like a real estate tour guide describing scenery that belonged to someone else. I overheard pieces of conversation drifting across the water on calm evenings. Words like community standards and neighborhood expectations. The message was always polite but unmistakably clear. In Karen Whitmore's mind, the lake had become part of her subdivision's selling point, a beautiful background feature meant to exist quietly beyond the property line while homeowners enjoyed the view from their patios. Fishing lines, boats, and laughter from the dock did not fit the brochure version of that picture. I tried to ignore it at first. Land disputes have a way of growing larger the more attention you feed them. But standing on that dock now, staring across water that smelled like chemicals instead of fresh lake air, I realized something important. Karen Whitmore had spent 3 years trying to control what happened on my lake. And sometime during the night before this morning, someone decided that controlling the lake meant changing the water itself. I stayed at the lake most of that morning, moving slowly along the shoreline with the uneasy feeling that someone had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last thin ribbon of mist that usually floats above the water at dawn, but the smell did not fade with the daylight. If anything, it grew sharper, like something synthetic that had no business mixing with fresh water. I knelt near the western bank where the shallows meet the reeds and dipped a small glass jar into the lake, sealing it tight before the breeze could push the scent away. The water looked almost normal at first glance, but a faint film shimmered across the surface when sunlight hit it at the right angle. I had spent enough years fishing here to know the difference between a natural algae bloom and something chemical. This was not nature. This was interference. Around mid-morning, I heard the distant hum of landscaping equipment drifting up from Willow Ridge Estates, the steady whine of lawn mowers and irrigation pumps running like clockwork through the subdivision. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically somewhere beyond the tree line, sending neat arcs of water over perfectly trimmed grass. It struck me how strange that sound felt while I stood next to a lake that suddenly smelled like a storage shed full of cleaning supplies. I walked back to the dock and sat down on the weathered cedar boards, letting my boots rest against the edge where the water gently tapped the wood. For a long time I just listened, whined through the willow branches, a hawk circling above the far pasture, the distant murmur of suburban routine continuing as if nothing had changed. Whoever had done this probably believed they were solving a problem. Maybe they thought contaminating the water would scare me into giving up fishing here. Maybe they assumed the lake would recover quickly and nobody would ever trace the cause. People make confident decisions when they do not fully understand the systems they are interfering with. My grandfather warned me about that kind of thinking more than once. He used to spread old survey maps across the kitchen table and show me how the land was connected beneath the surface. Rainwater running down the hills, underground flow channels feeding the basin, the overflow system carefully designed so the lake stayed healthy even during heavy storms. To most people, Carter Lake looked like a quiet patch of water surrounded by grass and trees. But beneath that calm surface was a network of pipes, channels, and permits that had been approved decades before a single house appeared in Willow Ridge Estates. I stood up and walked toward the old barn where my grandfather kept his records, the gravel crunching beneath my boots in the dry morning heat. The metal cabinet inside still held every document he ever filed with the county, stacked in neat folders that smelled faintly of paper and machine oil. I opened the drawer labeled Water Management and began flipping through maps and permits until I found the engineering diagram I remembered from childhood. A thin blue line ran from the lake's southern spillway through a controlled filtration system installed in the early 1990s. From there, the pipeline continued downhill toward the valley where Willow Ridge Estates now stood. I traced the line slowly with my finger, remembering the day my father explained what it meant. The subdivision below had permission to draw treated freshwater from the lake during certain months of the year under a shared resource agreement filed with the county. It had always seemed like a minor detail because the system rarely needed to run at full capacity. But as I stood there staring at that map, the quiet realization settled in like the weight of a stone. The water flowing through every sprinkler, every kitchen faucet, every swimming pool pump in that beautiful new neighborhood started its journey right here in this lake. And at that moment the lake smelled like chemicals. I stood there in the dusty light of the barn for a long moment, staring at that blue pipeline line on the old engineering map while the smell of the lake still lingered in my memory. The paper felt fragile in my hands, but the information printed on it carried the kind of weight that does not fade with time. Carter Lake was not just scenery. It was infrastructure. That spillway system my grandfather helped approve decades ago fed a small filtration unit installed on the south end of the property in 1992. and from there the treated water traveled downhill through a buried pipeline that ran straight into the service pumps for Willow Ridge Estates. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice explaining it again the way he did when I was 12 years old and curious about everything inside that metal cabinet. He always said the most important part of owning land was understanding how everything connected. Water, soil, drainage, rights of access. When people build communities, they tend to assume the land will quietly cooperate forever. But land does not work that way. Systems depend on balance. And when someone interferes with one piece of the system, the consequences rarely stay in one place. I rolled the map closed and walked back outside into the bright afternoon sun. The wind had picked up slightly, pushing small ripples across the lake, but the smell was still there. Subtle now, but unmistakable if you knew what to look for. I filled another jar from the shoreline and set it carefully on the tailgate of my truck next to the first sample. The next step was obvious. I needed the county environmental office to test the water and document whatever had been introduced into the lake. But while I drove into town that afternoon, another thought kept working its way through the back of my mind. Whoever dumped chemicals into this water probably believed they were making the lake unusable for fishing. Maybe they thought contamination would scare me into shutting down access to the dock. Maybe they assumed the water would dilute quickly enough that nobody would notice. What they clearly did not consider was the simple reality printed on that engineering diagram. If the lake water was contaminated, the pipeline feeding Willow Ridge Estates could not legally continue operating until the source was confirmed safe. County environmental rules were very clear about that. Any sign of chemical contamination in a shared water source triggered an immediate suspension of distribution until testing verified the water was clean. By the time I returned to the property later that afternoon, the quiet of the lake felt heavier than it had that morning. The sunlight stretched across the water in long golden lines, and the willow branches rustled softly in the breeze. Down the hill, I could see the rooftops of Willow Ridge Estates glowing in the late daylight, sprinklers still ticking across bright green lawns, as if the world below had not changed. But I knew something they did not. If the test results confirmed what my nose and eyes already suspected, that entire neighborhood was about to discover that the calm surface of Carter Lake was connected to far more than the view from their back patios. I pulled up to the county environmental office late that afternoon, the truck's tires crunching against the gravel in the parking lot. I could see the lights on through the window, and the silhouette of a worker inside, hunched over a desk. My boots clacked against the concrete floor as I walked toward the door, the second jar of lake water in hand, sealed tight, and showing just a faint trace of oil at the top. I knocked on the door and waited, the soft echo of my knock bouncing off the walls in the otherwise quiet office. A tall man in his late 40s looked up from the desk, his face lined with years of outdoor work and late nights spent testing soil and water. His name was Greg, and he had been doing this job for more than 25 years. He glanced at the jar in my hand, then at me, his expression giving nothing away. "What's this?" he asked, voice steady but curious. "Lake water," I replied, setting the jar down on the desk between us. "I think someone dumped something in it. I need you to test it." He paused for a moment, studying the jar as if considering it carefully. The air felt thick with anticipation. Then he nodded, pushing his glasses back up the bridge of his nose. "All right, let's see what we're dealing with." The next few hours dragged by slowly as I sat in the small waiting area, my mind replaying the events of the past few weeks. The feeling of helplessness that had grown stronger with every letter from the HOA, every complaint, every new problem that Karen seemed to throw my way. But as much as I resented her intrusion, this moment felt different. The power wasn't in her hands anymore. I was about to find out exactly what had been done to my lake, and the truth was going to be the thing that tipped the scales. I watched the clock slowly tick by, each second stretching into what felt like a small eternity. Finally, Greg emerged from the back office, holding a thick file in his hands. His face had changed, now more serious than when I had walked in. "We've got a problem," he said. My heart sank. "What's wrong?" Greg set the file on the counter and flipped it open, pointing to the results in black ink. "We ran the tests. There's a chemical compound in the water I've only seen a few times, and not in lakes like yours. It's a fertilizer compound, but it's mixed with a pesticide. It's the kind of thing you use when you're trying to kill off aquatic life quickly, and it doesn't just affect the fish. It affects the water supply too." My mind raced, and I could feel the weight of the words sinking in. Karen's plan, or whoever she had convinced to do this, was bigger than I had realized. The water they were using wasn't just for the lake. It was part of a network, a system that served the entire Willow Ridge Estates community. If the water was contaminated, the entire neighborhood would be affected. How long does it take for something like this to show up? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. A day, maybe two, Greg replied. But it depends on how much was dumped in. You're looking at more than just a few fish dying. This could impact the whole irrigation system for the subdivision. If you don't fix this soon, they'll be left without water for anything. I felt a sudden weight in my chest. I wasn't just dealing with a petty neighborhood dispute anymore. I was holding the key to a situation that could bring down everything Karen had worked for. The moment felt surreal, as if the world outside had stopped moving while I stood there processing what this could mean. I need you to document this, Greg, I said, my voice firm. I'm going to take it to the authorities. We'll put a stop to this. Greg nodded, his expression unreadable. I'll take care of it. As I turned to leave, I couldn't help but feel the rush of something I hadn't felt in weeks. Control. I had the evidence now. The truth was in my hands, and it was only a matter of time before Karen realized she had made a serious mistake. By the time I reached the county courthouse, the morning had already slipped into a quiet afternoon. The heat of the day pressed in from every direction, making the air feel thick and heavy, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I could see the reflection of the courthouse steps shimmering in the distance as I walked toward the entrance, my hands still feeling the cool weight of the documents Greg had given me. The files were thick, heavy with evidence that could change everything, and I knew that once I handed them over, there would be no going back. The doors to the courthouse opened with a slow creak, and I stepped inside, the cool air hitting me like a wave. The lobby was quiet, with only a few people scattered about, going about their business. But as I approached the desk, the clerk looked up with a curious expression. She was probably used to seeing all kinds of documents come through, but there was something different about these. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice friendly but businesslike. "I need to file a complaint. Environmental contamination. And I want to make sure it's handled immediately." The clerk raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as she took the files from my hands. She flipped through the stack of papers briefly, pausing as she scanned through the test results from the environmental office. I could see her brow furrow slightly as she skimmed over the details, her expression growing more serious with every line she read. Finally, she looked up at me. "This is quite a bit of information. Are you certain about this?" "I'm certain," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I know what happened to the lake, and I know who's behind it. It's time to make them face the consequences." The clerk nodded, pushing the papers aside and reaching for a different set of forms. "I'll need to file this with the environmental office. It'll go to the county attorney after that. We'll get the ball rolling." She paused for a moment, then added, "I can't guarantee it'll be fast, but it will be handled." I appreciated the honesty, but I wasn't about to wait weeks for something that needed to happen now. I had already given enough time to Karen Whitmore and the HOA to get away with their interference. It was my land, my water, and I was done letting them play puppet master with everything I held dear. "It needs to be fast," I said firmly. "I have a lot more to show than just these test results. They'll be losing more than their water if this keeps going." She raised an eyebrow again, but said nothing as she finished filing the papers. I watched her work, my mind racing. I could feel the weight of everything pressing on me. It was no longer just about the lake. It was about proving a point. It was about making sure that people like Karen Whitmore and her HOA cronies realized that they could not just come into a community, take control, and destroy everything that people had worked for. They had made their move, and now it was my turn. When I left the courthouse that afternoon, I had the confirmation I needed. The case would be escalated. The county attorney would be involved. I had the paperwork, the evidence, and the momentum. And in the end, Karen's so-called perfect little community would learn that messing with someone's legacy wasn't as easy as it seemed. They had underestimated me, and that mistake was going to cost them more than they ever imagined. I had been expecting it to be difficult, but nothing could have prepared me for the moment when I walked into the Willow Ridge Estates HOA meeting that evening. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, the kind of tension you feel just before a storm hits. I could see Karen sitting at the head of the table, her perfectly styled hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights, her smile tight and practiced as she greeted the crowd. Around the table, the other board members were nodding along, looking like they were all in agreement with whatever she had said. It was as if they thought they had everything under control, that they had the power to decide what happened with the land, the lake, and my property. As I took my seat at the back of the room, I felt the weight of their eyes on me, the silent judgment from people who didn't know me but thought they understood everything about how the world worked. Karen didn't waste any time. "I'm glad we could all come together tonight," she said, her voice smooth and confident, like she was addressing a room full of people who were just waiting for her instructions. "As most of you know, we've been dealing with some issues related to the property on the north end of the lake. The owner has been causing disruptions for our residents, and we're here to discuss the next steps." I could feel my heart rate pick up as I listened to her, but I didn't interrupt. She was spinning this into something that wasn't even close to the truth, and I knew it. "We've made several attempts to reach out and resolve these issues amicably," she continued, her eyes flicking toward me for a brief moment. "But it seems that the owner is refusing to cooperate. As a result, we're considering further action." That was the moment I had been waiting for. I stood up slowly, my voice calm but firm as I addressed the room. "Actually, Karen, I'm the owner of the land you're talking about, and I'm here to tell you that everything you're doing is illegal." The room fell silent, the murmurs from the board members stopping instantly. Karen's smile faltered for just a moment, and I could see the unease in her eyes. She wasn't expecting this. She wasn't expecting someone to stand up to her in front of all these people. "I've filed official complaints with the county about the illegal actions you and your board have taken regarding my property," I continued, my voice steady. "And I've already submitted the evidence to the environmental office. The water that you're drawing from the lake is contaminated, and if you don't stop using it immediately, there will be serious consequences for your whole neighborhood." Karen opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "I've already spoken with the county attorney. They'll be reviewing your actions. You're about to find out just how far you've overstepped your boundaries." There was a moment of stillness, as if the entire room was holding its breath. Then, slowly, one by one, the other board members began to look at Karen with uncertain eyes. She had been the one holding all the power, pulling the strings behind the scenes, but now the tables were turning. I could see the cracks starting to form in her armor. She was no longer the confident leader of the HOA. She was just a person, facing the consequences of her actions. "This isn't over," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "You won't get away with this." I smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I'm not the one who has to worry about getting away with anything, Karen. You are." The room stayed quiet for a long time after that, but it was clear that the power had shifted. The game was no longer in her hands, and I was about to make sure she realized just how serious this situation was. As I turned to leave, I could feel the eyes of the entire room on me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was the one in control. The following week, I received a phone call from the county attorney's office. The conversation was brief, but the tone was clear. The case had been escalated, and the first steps were already underway. The county had reviewed the evidence I submitted, and they were now preparing to issue formal notices to the HOA. It wasn't just the water contamination anymore. They were going to dig deeper into the illegal construction, the falsified permits, and everything else Karen had tried to hide. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. For the first time in months, I could breathe. But even then, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't going to give up that easily. She had been running things for too long to just let it slip away. A couple of days later, I drove out to the lake again. The sun was lower now, casting a soft golden light across the water. As I stood on the dock, looking out over the surface of the lake, I felt a sense of ownership settle in my chest. This wasn't just land anymore. It was my family's legacy, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away. Karen didn't know it yet, but her game was over. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of phone calls, meetings, and legal paperwork. The county had started issuing subpoenas, and Karen's HOA was scrambling to cover their tracks. Their perfect little world was starting to unravel, piece by piece. The first real blow came when they received an official cease and desist order from the county, demanding they stop using the lake water until further notice. The sprinkler systems in Willow Ridge estates were turned off, and the lawns that had been so perfectly manicured began to dry up. Pools that had been filled for weeks now sat empty, their once sparkling blue surfaces fading to murky green. The HOA tried to fight it, of course. Karen put up a front, calling meetings, trying to rally the residents with talk of property values plummeting, of how the community was going to fall apart without their precious water supply. But the more she spoke, the more people began to see her for what she was. Someone who had pushed too far and was now trying to save face. The residents who had once followed her blindly were starting to ask questions. And when the truth about the illegal water usage came out, the pressure on Karen grew too much. One by one, the board members began distancing themselves from her, and soon enough, the entire HOA was in disarray. The final nail in the coffin came when the county finally held a public hearing. I sat in the back of the room, watching as the attorney laid out the evidence. Karen, who had once controlled every conversation, now had no choice but to sit there in silence. The room was full, the atmosphere electric, as people finally understood what had been happening behind closed doors. The county attorney turned to Karen. "Your actions have not only disrupted the residents of this community," he said, "but you have also put their health and safety at risk. The HOA will be dissolved, and any remaining legal claims will be processed through the proper channels." Karen's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing without sound. She had no defense left, and in that moment, I knew everything was about to change. The last few months of stress, the uncertainty, the frustration, it all finally paid off. As I walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, I felt the weight of everything lift off my shoulders. The sun had set, and the sky was darkening with the promise of a new beginning. Carter Lake was still there, as it had always been, and for the first time in a long while, I could finally look out at the water and know that it was mine to protect.